I worked highway patrol in Nevada for about 8 years before transferring to a desk job. People think traffic cops have it easy, pulling people over for speeding tickets, checking registration, maybe the occasional DUI. And most days, that's exactly what it is. Routine, boring even. But every so often you pull someone over and something feels wrong. This happened on a Tuesday afternoon in July, middle of summer, temperature pushing 105 degrees. I was running radar on I-15 about 40 miles outside Las Vegas when a white panel van blew past me doing 87 in a 65. Standard stuff. I flipped on my lights and pulled out after him. The van slowed down immediately and pulled over onto the shoulder. No evasion, no hesitation. Textbook stop. I ran the plates while I walked up, came back clean, registered to a Thomas Whitmore out of Henderson. No warrants, no priors. I approached the driver's side window. The guy who rolled it down was maybe mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt and khakis. Sweating pretty heavily, but then again, it was 105 degrees, and his AC was off. "Afternoon, sir. License and registration, please." He handed them over without a word. Hands steady, no nervous movements. I'd pulled over hundreds of people who were more nervous than this guy, and most of them were just worried about the ticket. "Mr. Whitmore, I clocked you at 87. You know why that's a problem?" "Yes, officer, I'm sorry. I was trying to get home and I guess I wasn't paying attention to my speed." "Where you coming from?" "Work. I'm a contractor. Just finished a job in Mesquite." Everything about this stop was normal, everything. But something made me look at the back of the van. The windows were covered from the inside with some kind of dark material. Cardboard, maybe. "What do you do for work, Mr. Whitmore?" "Drywall installation." "That your equipment in the back?" "Yes, sir." I nodded, handed him back his license. "I'm going to let you off with a warning this time, but I need to take a quick look in the back of your van. Standard procedure." That's when his demeanor changed, not dramatically, just a flicker. His jaw tensed. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the steering wheel, gripped it a little tighter. "Is that necessary? I'm already running late." "Won't take more than a minute." He didn't argue after that, just nodded and popped the back doors for me. I walked around to the rear of the van, opened the doors. The smell hit me first, not strong, but there. Sweat, urine, maybe something worse. And it was hot back there, way hotter than it should have been with those windows covered. There was drywall equipment, mud pans, taping knives, a couple rolls of mesh tape. All of it looked used, legitimate, but there was also a large blue tarp bunched up in the corner. "Mr. Whitmore, what's under the tarp?" "Just some scrap material, leftover drywall pieces." "Mind if I check?" Another hesitation. "Go ahead." I pulled back the tarp. At first I thought it was a mannequin. That's what my brain tried to tell me anyway, because what I was looking at couldn't be a person, couldn't be real. But it was. A young woman, maybe early 20s, bound with zip ties at the wrists and ankles, duct tape over her mouth, eyes open, staring up at me with pure terror. She was alive. I drew my weapon immediately. "Get out of the vehicle! Hands where I can see them, now!" Whitmore didn't run, didn't fight. He just got out of the van slowly, hands up, and said, "You weren't supposed to look in there." Backup arrived within minutes. The girl was dehydrated, traumatized, but alive. She'd been missing for 6 days, taken from a grocery store parking lot in Henderson. Whitmore had been keeping her in his garage, bringing her out only when he needed to move her somewhere quieter, as he later told detectives. We found 2 more girls in his garage, both deceased. Both had been there for months. The thing that still gets me is how normal he seemed, how calm. If I hadn't looked in that van, if I'd just written him a warning and let him go, that girl would have been number 3. Sometimes I think about all the other times I didn't look, all the other vans I let drive away with just a speeding ticket. I wonder how many I missed. I worked homicide in Philadelphia for 12 years before I moved into cold cases. Cold cases are different from active investigations. You're not chasing leads, you're re-examining old ones. You're looking at crime scenes that are decades old, witnesses who don't remember, evidence that's been sitting in storage for years. Most cold cases don't get solved. That's just the reality. But every so often something breaks open. This case involved a woman named Catherine Mills, who disappeared in 1987. She was 24 years old, lived alone in a row house in South Philly, worked as a bank teller. One day she just didn't show up for work. When her manager called her apartment, no answer. When police did a welfare check, the door was unlocked. Apartment was empty, no signs of struggle. She was just gone. For 30 years, the case sat cold. Then, in 2017, the house where Catherine had lived went up for sale. The new owners wanted to do renovations, and during the demolition they found something in the walls. That's when they called us. I drove over to the house on a Thursday morning. The new owners were standing outside with a contractor who looked pale and shaken. He led me inside through the gutted first floor to what used to be the kitchen. There was a hole in the wall, about 3 feet wide, running floor to ceiling. And inside that hole, wedged between the studs, was a body, mummified, partially skeletal, still wearing the remains of a bank teller uniform. Catherine Mills had been in that house the entire time, hidden in the walls. The autopsy showed blunt force trauma to the skull. She'd been murdered, then sealed into the wall while the house was undergoing renovations in 1987. According to records, those renovations had been done by the landlord at the time, a man named Eugene Corbett. We tracked Corbett down. He was 78 years old, living in a nursing home in Delaware. When we brought him in for questioning, he didn't deny it. He said Catherine had threatened to report him to the city for code violations, so he hit her with a hammer, then used the renovations as cover to hide the body. He'd been living in the upstairs apartment while she was sealed in the wall below him. For 2 years, he lived directly above her. Then he sold the house and moved away. The thing that bothers me most is that for 30 years people lived in that house, cooked meals in that kitchen, celebrated birthdays, holidays, raised kids, and the whole time Catherine was right there, in the walls, waiting to be found. I was a K-9 officer in Oregon for about 9 years. My partner was a German shepherd named Gunnar, best nose I ever worked with. We did narcotics mostly, but Gunnar was cross-trained for cadaver work too. This happened on a Saturday morning in October. We got called out to assist with a search for a missing hiker in the Mount Hood National Forest. Guy named Derek Paulson, 32 years old, hadn't returned from a solo camping trip. His car was still at the trailhead. Tent was gone from his campsite, but no sign of him. Search and rescue had been out there for 2 days with no luck. That's when they called in the K-9 units. Gunnar and I started at the campsite and worked outward. The terrain was rough, dense forest, steep ravines, lots of ground to cover. We'd been searching for about 3 hours when Gunnar alerted. Not a normal alert. He stopped dead, hackles up, let out this low growl I'd only heard a handful of times. That wasn't his narcotics alert. That wasn't even his cadaver alert. That was his something's wrong alert. I followed his line of sight. He was staring at a thick grove of trees about 50 yards off the trail. I called it in, then moved toward the trees with Gunnar leading. That's when I smelled it. Decomp. Faint, but unmistakable. We found Derek Paulson about 20 feet into the grove. He was hanging from a tree, makeshift noose around his neck, camping rope tied to a branch about 8 feet up. Suicide, I thought. Terrible, but not uncommon out here. People come to the woods to end things sometimes, but Gunnar wouldn't stop alerting. He was focused on something else, something near the base of the tree. I walked over, looked down. There were 2 more bodies, both partially buried in shallow graves covered with leaves and branches, both in advanced stages of decomposition. One was a woman, maybe mid-20s. The other was a teenage boy. Derek Paulson wasn't a hiker who'd taken his own life. He was a killer who'd buried his victims out here, then hung himself when he realized search and rescue was closing in. We found IDs on both bodies. The woman had been missing for 8 months, the boy for almost a year, both from different parts of Oregon. No connection between them except Derek Paulson. The medical examiner said they'd both been strangled. Same M.O. Same type of rope Derek used to hang himself. We searched the area for 2 more days. Found 3 more graves. All women. All strangled. Derek Paulson had been killing people and burying them in that forest for at least 3 years. His suicide note found in his tent just said, "I can't stop. I'm sorry." Gunnar got a commendation for that find. Saved us weeks of searching. But sometimes I still think about how many people walked past that grove of trees. Hikers, campers, families. How close they came to those graves without ever knowing. And I wonder if Derek Paulson was watching them from the trees, deciding whether or not to add them to his collection. I worked as a corrections officer at a maximum security facility in Michigan for 11 years. It's not a job most people understand. You're not law enforcement in the traditional sense, but you're dealing with some of the worst people society has to offer. Murderers, rapists, gang members every day. You learn to read people, learn to spot trouble before it starts, learn which inmates are dangerous and which ones are just trying to do their time quietly. This story is about an inmate named Marcus Webb. He was doing 25 years for second-degree murder, killed his girlfriend's ex-husband in a bar fight that went too far. By all accounts, Marcus was a model prisoner. Polite, kept to himself, never caused problems. He'd been there about 7 years when I started noticing something odd. Marcus's cell was on C block, 3rd tier. Every morning during count, I'd walk past and he'd be sitting on his bunk, reading or writing letters. Normal stuff. But over the course of about 2 months, I noticed his cell was getting emptier. Inmates accumulate things. Books, magazines, letters from family, photos. It's normal. But Marcus was getting rid of things. Slowly. 1 week his shelf would have fewer books, the next week fewer photos on the wall. I asked him about it during rounds one day. "You doing some spring cleaning, Marcus?" He looked up from his book and smiled. "Something like that. Just simplifying. You okay? Everything all right?" "Never better, boss. Never better." That should have been a red flag. Inmates don't say, "never better." They complain, they bargain, they tell you about their appeals. They don't say they're doing great. 2 weeks later, Marcus's cell was completely empty. No books, no photos, no letters. Just his bunk, his toilet, and Marcus. I reported it to my supervisor. He said to keep an eye on it, but not to worry too much. Some inmates go through phases. The next morning, Marcus didn't stand for count. I approached his cell. He was lying on his bunk, facing the wall, blanket pulled up to his shoulders. "Marcus, stand up for count." No response. "Marcus, I'm not going to ask again." Still nothing. I opened the cell door and walked in. That's when I saw the smell. Metallic, copper, blood. I pulled back the blanket. Marcus had been dead for at least 6 hours, slit his wrists with a sharpened piece of metal he'd somehow smuggled or fashioned. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he'd written on the wall in his own blood. 23 names. We ran every name, cross-referenced them with missing persons databases, unsolved homicides, cold cases. 18 of them matched. 18 women, all missing or murdered over a 15-year period before Marcus went to prison, all in Michigan, all within a 100-mile radius of Detroit. Marcus Webb wasn't in prison for killing his girlfriend's ex-husband. He was in prison because that was the one time he got caught. The other 18, he'd gotten away with them. He'd been living with that for 7 years, and when he finally decided he couldn't live with it anymore, he confessed the only way he knew how. We found 3 more bodies based on information in his cell, buried in locations he'd marked on a hand-drawn map hidden in his mattress. The families got closure. But I still think about those 2 months, how he was preparing to die, getting rid of his possessions one by one like he was packing for a trip. And I think about the 23 names on that wall, written in blood, and I wonder if there were more that he didn't write down. I worked for U.S. Border Patrol at the Calexico Port of Entry for about 6 years. It's one of the busiest crossings on the southern border. Thousands of vehicles come through every day. Most of them are routine. People going to work, visiting family, commercial trucks hauling goods. But every so often something comes through that isn't routine. This happened on a Wednesday afternoon in August. Hot. Probably 110 degrees. The line of cars was backed up for miles, and we were processing them as fast as we could. A green Honda Civic pulled up to my station. Driver was a woman in her 30s, alone in the car. California plates. She handed me her passport and smiled. "Afternoon, ma'am. What's the purpose of your trip to Mexico?" "Just visiting family in Mexicali, day trip." "Anything to declare?" "No, nothing." I glanced in the back seat. Empty. Looked in the trunk through the rear window. Empty. Everything seemed fine. But then I noticed something. The car was sitting low. Lower than a Honda Civic should sit, even with a driver. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to pull over to secondary inspection." Her smile faltered. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine. Pull over to the right, please." She did as I asked. I radioed for backup and met her at the inspection area. We popped the trunk. Nothing. Checked the back seat. Nothing. Ran the plates and her ID. Both clean. But the car was still sitting too low. My partner, a guy named Rodriguez, walked around the vehicle. Then he knelt down and looked underneath. "Hey!" he called out. "Come look at this!" I walked over. He was pointing at the undercarriage. Someone had welded a metal box to the bottom of the car, about 4 feet long, maybe 18 inches wide, big enough to fit. "Mum, do you know what's attached to your vehicle?" She started crying immediately. "They made me. They said they'd kill my daughter if I didn't do it." We got her out of the car and called in a mechanic with cutting tools. It took about 20 minutes to remove the box. When we opened it, I expected drugs, maybe weapons. It wasn't drugs. It was a person. A teenage girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old, bound and gagged, barely conscious. She'd been in that box for at least 3 hours. in 110-degree heat, with almost no air. The driver, her name was Sandra Ortiz, told us everything. A cartel had kidnapped her daughter 2 weeks ago. They said if she didn't smuggle the girl across the border, they'd kill both of them. The girl in the box was being trafficked. Sandra was just the mule. We got the girl to a hospital. She survived, barely. Sandra gave us everything she knew about the cartel. Her daughter was recovered 3 days later in a raid in Tijuana. But here's what keeps me up at night. How many cars like that have I waved through? How many times have I looked at a vehicle and not noticed it was sitting too low? How many people have been smuggled across in boxes just like that one, and I never saw it? The girl we found that day was one of the lucky ones, but I know there were others who weren't, and I'll never know how many. I worked as a crime scene investigator in Dallas for 14 years. Most CSI work isn't like what you see on TV. It's tedious, methodical, and often heartbreaking. You're documenting the worst moments of people's lives. Suicides are some of the hardest scenes to process, not because they're complex, usually they're pretty straightforward, but because of the weight of it, knowing someone chose to end their life, seeing what they left behind. This case started as a suicide. We got called out to an apartment in East Dallas on a Sunday morning. Male victim, mid-30s, found hanging from a ceiling beam in his living room. Door was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. Suicide note on the kitchen table. The responding officers had already cut him down by the time I arrived, which isn't ideal for scene preservation, but they'd taken photos first. Standard procedure. I started documenting everything. The ligature marks on his neck were consistent with hanging. The chair he'd presumably stood on was kicked over beneath the beam. The note was handwritten, apologizing to his family, saying he couldn't go on anymore. Everything pointed to suicide. But something was bothering me. The victim's name was Jason Reeves. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt. His feet were bare, and when I looked at the soles of his feet, they were clean, completely clean. The apartment was filthy. Dirty dishes in the sink, trash overflowing, floor covered in grime. If Jason had walked from anywhere in that apartment to the chair, his feet should have been dirty. I checked the chair. It was dusty, but there were no footprints on the seat. I looked up at the beam. Jason had supposedly tied the rope up there himself, stood on the chair, then kicked it away. But the beam was at least 9 feet high. Even standing on the chair, he would have needed to reach up to tie the knot. I checked his hands, no rope burns, no fibers under his nails. And then I looked at the note again. It was handwritten in blue ink. I checked the kitchen. There were 3 pens on the counter, all of them black. I bagged the note and sent it for analysis. The handwriting matched Jason's. He'd definitely written it. But the lab found something interesting. Impressions on the paper, like someone had held a gun to the back of it while he wrote. We re-examined the scene as a homicide, found evidence of cleaning solution on the floor near the chair. Someone had wiped away footprints. Found a second set of fingerprints on the beam, too small to be Jason's. The medical examiner re-examined the body, found bruising on Jason's wrists, consistent with being restrained, and tox screen came back positive for Rohypnol, roofies. Jason Reeves didn't kill himself. Someone drugged him, forced him to write a suicide note, then strung him up and staged the scene. We eventually arrested his girlfriend. She'd been cheating on him, wanted out of the relationship, and knew Jason had a life insurance policy that paid double for accidental death but nothing for suicide. So she tried to make it look like suicide, knowing the insurance company would investigate, find inconsistencies, and rule it accidental death instead. She'd spent hours staging that scene, cleaning, positioning, making sure everything looked right. She almost got away with it. If I hadn't noticed his clean feet, if I'd just processed it as a suicide and moved on, she would have collected the insurance money and no one would have known. That case taught me something important. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is, even when everything looks perfect.